On a chilly spring morning in the wilderness of northern Canada, 17 American soldiers were making their way across the freezing waters of Charlie Lake. Beneath their feet was a makeshift pontoon raft, carrying a D4 Caterpillar tractor, a military vehicle, drums of oil, and supplies. The nearest shore was more than a mile away. Then conditions began to deteriorate. Within 2 minutes, the raft and everything aboard it would disappear beneath the water, leaving 17 men fighting for their lives in conditions where survival could be measured in minutes. But, unbeknown to the men, someone on the distant shoreline had been watching their progress through a pair of binoculars, and when he realized the raft had vanished, he did something quite extraordinary. On the morning of May 14, 1942, Gus Hedin was preparing breakfast in his cabin on the shore of Charlie Lake, just a few miles north of the small town of Fort St. John in British Columbia. Gus was a homesteader and a trapper, accustomed to the isolation of this part of Canada, but recently there had been some unusual activity around the lake. In the weeks before that morning, thousands of American soldiers had begun arriving in the region, bringing with them trucks, bulldozers, and heavy equipment. For a quiet community such as Fort St. John, their sudden appearance must have been extraordinary. But the soldiers had not come to Canada to fight. They had come to build a road. 5 months earlier, on December the 7th, 1941, Japanese aircraft had attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. The following day, the United States entered the Second World War, and almost immediately attention turned towards Alaska. Separated from the rest of the United States by more than 1,000 miles of Canadian territory, Alaska was suddenly considered dangerously vulnerable. Much of the equipment and supplies needed there had traditionally arrived by sea, but with American forces now fighting Japan across the Pacific, military planners wanted another way of reaching and supplying the territory. The answer was an overland route through Canada. The idea of building such a road had existed for years, but the war transformed what had once been an ambitious proposal into an urgent military necessity. In February 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt approved the construction of what became known as the Alaska-Canada or Alcan Highway. Canada agreed to allow the road to pass through British Columbia and the Yukon, and within weeks an enormous military engineering operation was underway. The timetable was extraordinary. Nearly 11,000 American soldiers would eventually be sent north to help build the highway, many with little experience of the conditions they were about to encounter. There would be no years of careful preparation before construction began. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers would first carve a rough pioneer road through the wilderness, while civilian contractors followed behind making the necessary improvements. And there was an enormous amount standing in their way. Dense forests had to be cleared and bridges thrown across rivers. Heavy machinery had to be hauled through deep muskeg, while the men themselves faced mud, insects, extreme isolation, and weather that could change dramatically with the seasons. Yet the pressure to keep moving was relentless. America was at war. Alaska needed a secure supply route, and the engineers had been given only months to build it. By the spring of 1942, that enormous undertaking had reached the area around Fort St. John. And that was why, as Gus Hedin prepared his breakfast beside Charlie Lake that morning, there were American soldiers out on the water. The men belonged to the 341st Engineer Regiment, one of the units working northwards through British Columbia. A bivouac site had been established for Company E at the northern end of Charlie Lake, around 12 miles away, and men, equipment and supplies needed to be moved there so that the work on the highway could continue. Getting everything around the lake by land would take time. Taking it across the water offered a much quicker solution. The previous day, a pontoon raft had been constructed under the supervision of Lieutenant John Langendorf of the 74th Engineer Company. It consisted of 3 pontoon boats joined together, with canvas covers fitted across the forward compartments to help prevent water from entering. It was powered by two small 22 horsepower motors. Then came the load. A radio command car was driven aboard, together with a D4 Caterpillar tractor, drums of oil and other supplies needed at the camp. 17 soldiers would make the journey with them. It was a considerable amount of weight to carry across 12 miles of open water, and Charlie Lake was still emerging from a long Canadian winter. Broken spring ice remained on parts of the lake, while beneath it the water was bitterly cold. People from the Fort St. John area who knew Charlie Lake well were concerned about what the soldiers were attempting and reportedly warned the engineers against making the crossing in those conditions. But the Americans were working to an extraordinary timetable, and every delay threatened to slow the advance of the highway farther north. Shortly after 8 o'clock that morning, the heavily laden raft pulled away from the 341st Engineer Regiment landing at the southern end of Charlie Lake. The water was already choppy, with waves of around a foot rolling across its surface. But the raft continued north. At first there was little reason to believe the journey would end in tragedy. From his cabin on the northwestern shore, Gus Hedin noticed the unusual craft making its way slowly along the lake. Every so often he picked up his binoculars and checked its progress. Then he returned to his breakfast. As the raft continued north, however, the wind began to strengthen. The 1-foot waves that had accompanied the men when they left the southern end of Charlie Lake gradually increased to 2 and then 3 feet, while the heavily laden raft struggled against a growing headwind. Progress became painfully slow. The two small motors were labouring to propel the heavily laden raft and its considerable cargo through miles of increasingly rough water. The journey had begun shortly after 8 o'clock. By around 11:15, more than 3 hours later, they had covered only about 2/3 of the 12 miles to Company E's camp, and they were now in the middle of the lake. Then one of the motors developed a problem. A plug came out of its fuel line and gasoline began draining away. Major John Marvin Turvey, the officer in charge of the expedition, realized that continuing towards the northern end of the lake was no longer the safest option. The raft had just rounded a headland, and with the worsening conditions and one of the motors losing fuel, he ordered the men to turn towards the western shore. It was during that turn that everything changed. As the raft swung around, its broadside became exposed to the waves. 2 struck in quick succession. Water poured into the right-hand pontoon. The canvas covering that had been fitted to help keep the water out could do little against the sudden rush, and as the pontoon flooded, it began to sink beneath the surface. The raft tipped sharply to one side, and for the 17 men aboard there was almost no time to react. The tremendous weight of the vehicles and equipment was now working against them as the raft settled lower into the water. Within moments it was clear that it could not recover. Less than 2 minutes after the first waves struck, the raft disappeared beneath Charlie Lake. The Caterpillar went down with it. So did the command car and all the other heavy cargo the men had spent more than 3 hours carrying north. And suddenly 17 soldiers were in the water, and the water was bitterly cold. Some couldn't swim, while others desperately tried to remain above the surface or find something from the sunken raft to cling onto. There were no modern survival suits to protect them from the freezing water, and the heavy clothing intended to keep them warm on land was now making their struggle even more difficult. The western shore they had been trying to reach was still some distance away. There was no rescue boat alongside them, and no immediate help coming from the camp at the northern end of the lake. For the men struggling among the waves, their chances of reaching land unaided were disappearing rapidly. Back in his cabin, Gus Hedin picked up his binoculars once more to check the raft's progress. He looked towards the place where it should have been. It wasn't there. For a moment there was nothing to see but the rough surface of Charlie Lake. Then Gus noticed something. Tiny shapes were moving in the water. Men were bobbing between the waves. He immediately understood what had happened. Within 2 minutes, Gus had reached the shore and launched his homemade 14-foot rowing boat. There was nobody to go with him, no motor to carry him quickly across the lake, and the same waves that had just overwhelmed the military raft were now waiting for him. Gus took up the oars and began to row. The soldiers were approximately 1.5 miles away, and it took Gus around 15 minutes to reach them. For the men in the water, those 15 minutes were devastating. 17 soldiers had gone into Charlie Lake, but by the time Gus finally reached the scene, only 9 were still afloat. Bringing his little boat alongside them, he began hauling the exhausted men from the water and managed to pull 2 aboard. Their clothing was soaked and heavy, and with the additional weight in such rough conditions, Gus's own boat was now in danger of being swamped. There were still others in the water, but he couldn't take them all at once, so he turned towards the shore and began the long row back. After getting the 2 men safely onto land, Gus could have stopped. He had already taken an enormous risk, rowing into rough water in a homemade boat to reach them, and his own little craft had come dangerously close to being overwhelmed. But there were still men out on Charlie Lake, so Gus turned his boat around and rowed back towards them. For the second time that morning, Gus Hedin pulled away from the safety of the shore and headed back across Charlie Lake. The wind was still blowing and the waves continued to threaten his small boat, while somewhere ahead of him men were desperately trying to remain above the surface. When Gus reached them again, he managed to haul another 2 soldiers aboard before turning once more for the shore. 4 men had now been rescued, but there were still others out on the lake, and so Gus made the journey for a 3rd time. By now the soldiers had been immersed in the freezing water for a considerable length of time. Their heavy clothing and boots made every movement more difficult, while the cold steadily robbed them of the strength they needed to keep themselves afloat. On his 3rd journey, Gus found 1 more man alive. He hauled him into the boat and began the long row back towards land. 5 men had been saved. 12 had not. By then there was little more that could be done for those who had disappeared beneath the water. That evening, Army engineers returned to Charlie Lake in boats, but now the purpose of their journey was very different. They carried grappling hooks, and somewhere beneath the surface were their missing comrades, along with the vehicles, machinery, and supplies that had disappeared with the raft. The rescue had become a recovery operation. It was grim and exhausting work, carried out on a deep lake whose waters remained dangerously cold. The search would continue for weeks, as one by one the bodies of the 12 soldiers were found and brought back from Charlie Lake. The last was not recovered until June the 9th, almost 4 weeks after the sinking. The 12 men who died belonged to the 341st Engineer Regiment and the 74th Engineer Company, 2 of the units that had been sent into the Fort St. John area as construction of the highway pushed northwards through British Columbia. In the aftermath, the US Army investigated what had happened. No misconduct was found, with the disaster instead attributed to a combination of circumstances: a heavily laden improvised raft, worsening conditions on the lake, and the mechanical problem that had led Major Turvey to abandon the journey north and turn towards shore. But the tragedy had also taken place against the backdrop of an extraordinary race against time. The men building the Alaska Highway had been sent into unfamiliar country and ordered to achieve in a matter of months what under normal circumstances might have taken years. There was little opportunity to stop, and after the tragedy at Charlie Lake, the work continued. Throughout the summer and into the autumn of 1942, construction crews pushed farther through the wilderness, cutting through forests, crossing rivers, and gradually joining the separate sections of road together. On September the 24th, crews approaching from opposite directions finally met at Contact Creek, close to the border between British Columbia and the Yukon. A little over a month later, on October the 28th, the entire route was complete. In little more than 6 months, the engineers had carved a rough road stretching around 1,700 miles through some of the most difficult terrain in North America. 12 of the men involved in that enormous undertaking never saw it completed. Gus Hedin, meanwhile, returned to the quiet life he had known before thousands of American soldiers arrived around Charlie Lake, although his extraordinary actions that morning did not go unrecognised. He was awarded a medal by the Humane Society of Canada, while the United States Army presented him with a letter of commendation. He was also reportedly given a reward of $1,000 by the American government, a considerable sum of money in 1942, in recognition of the 5 lives he had helped to save. More than 60 years later, another permanent tribute appeared on the shore of Charlie Lake. In 2008, a stainless steel memorial was erected at the southern end of Charlie Lake to remember the 12 soldiers who died. Standing 12 feet high, with a 12-foot circle, the memorial is surrounded by 12 individual posts, each representing one of the men who never came home from the lake. Their deaths mark the greatest single loss of life during the construction of the Alaska Highway, a project that would claim an estimated 30 lives before it was finished. Today, the Alaska Highway bears little resemblance to the rough pioneer road forced through the wilderness in 1942. Generations of travellers had followed the route those soldiers helped create, many passing close to Charlie Lake without ever knowing what happened there. The lake itself can appear remarkably peaceful, but on its shore stands a reminder of one chilly spring morning when 17 American soldiers set out carrying men and machinery towards a camp at the other end of the lake. They never reached it, and 5 of them survived because while preparing breakfast in a cabin on the distant shore, Gus Hedin happened to pick up his binoculars and noticed that the raft he had been watching was gone. There were men in the water. Within 2 minutes his little boat was launched, and without knowing whether it would survive the journey, Gus Hedin took up his oars and rowed towards them. I actually have an affinity to this story because we have family members who live in Fort St. John, just in the vicinity of Charlie Lake, one of whom has gone out kindly to take some up-to-date photos of the area that appear in this video, so thank you to them. And I think this was the story of 2 types of courage. Firstly, that of the brave engineers who set out to build the road under extraordinary conditions, 12 of whom sadly perished on the lake. And then there's the courage of Gus Hedin, who set out with little regard for his own safety onto the lake and rescued 5 soldiers. Now, despite the nature of the tragedy, I hope you appreciated the way the information was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll wish you bye-bye for now.